A very good evening to all our viewers and welcome to this week's edition of The Agenda. My name is Toivan Jabela, your host. Tonight we are discussing the delicate situation in Ukraine where Russian forces have invaded and are advancing as of late this week towards the capital, Kiev. And to discuss with us those events from a local point of view is Ambassador Tuliameni Kalomoh. He is a Namibian diplomat who served as ambassador of Namibia to the United States. He worked as an assistant secretary general to the late Kofi Annan, who was secretary general of the United Nations. And he also led a Namibian delegation to negotiations in the DRC between 1998 and 1999 when the country was under war. Namibia participated in that war much later. Ambassador, thank you for making time. We really are honored. I know you're a retired man and I took you out of your retirement, so thank you for agreeing to come to the show.
No, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for introducing the situation in Ukraine as complicated.
Yeah.
But thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. Now, that situation, Ambassador, obviously we know that in a way it has been a long time coming, but when you saw that convoy of military vehicles entering Ukraine from both the Russian border and later through Belarus, what was going through your mind? Is it something that surprised you, or you saw it that it was going to happen anytime?
It's true that the situation, the tension between Ukraine and Russia started a long time ago.
Yeah.
Actually started beginning the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons for that are, I believe, one, that Ukraine was the third largest country to hold nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
But those nuclear weapons were really for the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, Ukraine historically has been part of Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Even during the period of the 15 republics of constituting the Soviet Union, Ukraine had a special status.
Mm-hmm.
But the source of tension, of this current boil over of the tension, is really the eastward expansion of NATO.
Mm-hmm.
There has always been, since 1917, but particularly from 1922, when the Soviet Union came into being under Lenin, tension between the Western countries, and the then Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had chosen the path of economic development fundamentally different from that of the Western countries. That is socialism. They call it communism, but that's socialism.
Yeah.
And the Western countries have always desired to undermine the Soviet Union, weaken it, and destroy socialism. And obviously, after the Second World War, that transformed into competition. Competition over spheres of influence. That boiled over, linked on until the Soviet Union broke up, and the Western countries became triumphant, very euphoric, claiming that they had won the Cold War.
Yeah.
And therefore they moved east towards the Soviet Union until in 1994 they signed an agreement involving Russia, the United States, Ukraine, Britain, and Kazakhstan. Some Soviet nuclear forces were deployed in Kazakhstan, in the Asian part of the Soviet Union. China, France, and China and France, the other declared nuclear states, acceded to this memorandum of Budapest of 1994, which granted, number one, the security, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, but also the security of Russia. At that time, the United States first, in 1991, gave a solemn commitment that that NATO will not expand eastward. They did not live up to that commitment. Then there was this memorandum that granted the security of Russia, which meant there would be no nuclear weapon, there would be no membership of Ukraine of NATO, and then there will be no nuclear weapon. Missiles, advanced, whether they are nuclear armed or not nuclear armed, they can easily be nuclear armed. Now, that is one dimension. The other dimension is for a small country like Namibia, whose security is only granted by respect for sovereignty and the right to determine your own destiny. We believe that it's not a good idea for a big country to invade a small country. We believe that we should respect the right of people to determine their own future. But that is an ideal kind of situation. Realistically, the strong get what they want. The poor or the weaker accept what they must. So I personally believe that it would have been much better if Ukraine had chosen the policy that has been pursued by Finland of neutrality. Finland is, by all definition, a Western country. They pursue economic policy of capitalism. They trade closely with the Soviet Union and then with Russia, but they do not allow their country to be party of NATO or to have foreign bases in Finland. So I would have thought that Ukraine would have been well advised to pursue that kind of policy.
But and that is where it becomes tricky, Ambassador, because where does self-national interest begin and ends in relation to the interest of your neighbor? Because that is exactly what the Russians are saying, to say, look, in as much as you have the right to self-determination and to associate with whoever you want, this particular association endangers us. Where do you strike the balance?
The balance should be on the concept of survival.
Yeah.
On October Day in 1962, the Americans, they had a plane called the U-2 spy plane. They discovered that Khrushchev had the crates of missiles that were being offloaded in Cuba. And don't forget, Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. The Americans said, no, you cannot deploy weapons of this caliber and sophistication into our backyard. So Fidel Castro was refusing to have those crates of missiles withdrawn from Cuba. But a quid pro quo was agreed to between Khrushchev and Kennedy. Now, the older people advising Kennedy strongly felt that he should use nuclear weapons. What they did not know is that actually the Soviet Union had the weapons deployed close to the United States shores. But a deal was worked out that allowed the Soviet Union to withdraw those weapons, but also allowed the United States to withdraw their nuclear weapons from Turkey, called the Jupiters. And Turkey shares borders with the Soviet Union. Cuba shares waterways with the United States. No, what was good for the United States in 1962? That is the perception of survival. It's good today for Russia. The United States could not allow Cuba to host Russian missiles. Russia cannot allow the United States or NATO to deploy weapons, missiles in Ukraine.
Is there a limit to how much a country can pursue its own interest, especially when such interest is perceived to be a threat to their immediate neighbors?
Well, of course, ultimately, the defense of your own national interest is determined by the capacity to do so. Now, the existential threat felt by a country will determine the kind of action that country will deem necessary to defend their own national interest. I saw that you referred in your intro that I was part of the mediation, actually leader of the Namibian delegation to talks involving Rwanda, Uganda, Congo, Angola, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. That was, number one, Rwanda, after the genocide, the Hutus fled into Congo. And the Rwandese Patriotic Front, led by Kagame and others, felt that as long as those Hutus are in Congo, their security is not granted. So they pursued them into Congo. They pursued them into Congo, and they wanted to come to as far, they overthrew Mobutu, they installed the Kabila, but they also wanted to manipulate Kabila. So they invaded Congo in order to have a friendly government to secure their national interest. For Rwanda, it was national interest defined by the experience of genocide, and also economic interest that will allow them to exploit. So the defense of national interest depends also on the capacity of the country concerned to defend their own interests. Now, if you are neighboring a bigger country like Russia, and you flirt with hostile powers to threaten their interests, you run the risk of what we are witnessing today in Ukraine. However, you can win a Pyrrhic victory, meaning you can win the war, the battles, but lose the war. Because looking at the collective anger and determination of the people of Ukraine to defend their sovereignty and their right, you can occupy that territory, But it's just like the Americans and NATO occupying Afghanistan. The people may not accept, and that will be very costly.
So what it means then in that case, Ambassador, is that because it's a very pertinent point that you've made, that a war itself, I mean, there will always be dissent in regions and in pockets of the country. Is that the point you're driving to say that even if you now eventually capture the capital and all that, that there will always be such fights until there's great satisfaction for the people?
That is one aspect. That is what we had in Afghanistan. But the other, you can subdue people, but you will not have their cooperation. You cannot force them at gunpoint to accept the legitimacy of whatever government you install there. So we do not know. No one can predict, and this is the history of wars. You can have a plan of starting the war, but you cannot have a plan of how that war will end. So we don't know how the end will be, or what the end will be. It's very complicated. You have the eastern regions of Ukraine
that are loyal to,
that are predominantly Russians, and they are loyal to Russia. You have the southern regions of Crimea, which was Russian territory until as recently as 1954. It was just given to Ukraine by Khrushchev, who was believed to be under some influence, and he was himself a Ukrainian, and also he believed, I think correctly so, that the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, so it didn't matter who ruled which part of the territory of the Soviet Union. But now, under this threat, and given that the Soviet Black Sea fleet is concentrated in Crimea, it was inconceivable that Russia would allow that enclave of Crimea to be part of Ukraine, particularly also considering that Ukraine was aspiring to be a member of NATO.
Indeed. We go for a quick break and then return shortly afterwards.
Choose your flex package with Paratus today. Sign up for ultra-fast fiber with the convenience of mobile LTE. That's 2 products in 1 bundle. It's new, it's 1 bill, and you can stay connected in more than 1 location.
For more information, visit paratus.africa/NA.
Always prepared. Paratus.
We continue our conversation with Ambassador Tuliameni Kalomoh. Now, Ambassador, what do you think the Russians will do there? I mean, it's very unpredictable, but do you think they want to install some sort of puppet government in Kiev, or what will be the end game for them there?
Well, if experience is anything to go by, when the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan,
Yeah.
they overthrew the regime there and they installed their own person into power.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Americans did the same thing in South Vietnam
Yeah.
during Kennedy, and then they did the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
So it's conceivable that because this present government of Ukraine would survive for only that long. Eventually, they will be forced out.
You're referring to the current one of Zelensky or
Zelensky, yes,
Yeah.
Zelensky.
Yeah.
And I think Russia will find a willing Ukrainian who would take up the leadership. So that's what I think. I think they will install a person of their own.
You mentioned a very important historical fact of how the Americans installed their own puppet leaders, if I can call them that way, in Afghanistan. You spoke about Vietnam and Iraq, which brings me to the next question about moral authority. Does moral authority matter in diplomacy when, for example, a template is already in place? What the Russians are doing right now in Ukraine is essentially from a template that the Americans and the British, for example, have done in countries like Iraq in 2003, invading a country, no weapons of mass destruction whatsoever, kill the head of state of that country, and then when another superpower does the same, then they come with sanctions. I mean, why should the Russians listen to America when they say stop, when they couldn't stop themselves?
That is, there is one word for that, and it's called hypocrisy.
Yeah.
But there is no moral foreign policy. There is a foreign policy of interest. I saw something attributed to or ascribed to former US President Jim Carter, saying that the United States is 242 years old. Of those number of years as a republic, they have only known peace for 16 years. They've always been waging war. Always been waging war. And most of the time, it's war of aggression. You see, we have a case here of Diego Garcia here on the coast of Mauritius. In the advent of independence of Mauritius, the British, conniving with the Americans, uprooted the population of Diego Garcia from the islands of Diego Garcia and seized the territory of Diego Garcia and made it into a huge military and air force base of the United States. So there's no morality. There's simply a question of defending the strategic and economic interest of a power concerned. And each superpower takes advantage of the weakness or difficulties of the other. So the Americans are now rejoicing, having rallied the support of all the NATO members, some out of fear, like the Baltic countries, who were part of the former Soviet Union, but countries like Germany. And you see, we should not forget that when Napoleon invaded Russia, they passed through Ukraine in 1812. When Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, he passed through Ukraine. And don't forget, Hitler was on the gates of Moscow for 900 days.
Sure.
And 26 million Russians died in defense of their motherland between 1941 and 1945. They pursued Hitler from the gates of Moscow to the gates of Berlin. And therefore, the Germans, I think, should be aware of the trauma of the Russians as much as they should be aware of the trauma of the Jewish who were victims of the xenophobia of Hitler. So the Russians have that history at the back of their minds, that they are being encircled. If you look at the north, you have Lithuania, you have Estonia, you have Latvia. They are members of NATO. If you look at the west of Ukraine, you have Bulgaria, you have Romania, you have Poland. When you remove Ukraine, they will have a direct border with Russia. They are all members of NATO. So the Russians feel that they are being besieged, they are being encircled by a hostile power. And throughout history, the Americans have demonstrated their desire, their determination to undermine, weaken, and destroy Russia.
But what is at play right now, Ambassador, in terms of this competition between Russia and the West? Is it purely a question of power, or in what way, for example, in what other ways is Russia a threat to the West?
Russia is only a threat to the West in as far as they possess more than 600,000 nuclear warheads. Yes, Russia is the biggest country in the world, single biggest country in the world, with 17 million square kilometers. But it's a population of about 150 million. And it's a declining superpower. But possession of that number of nuclear warhead and the protection of the sites, the nuclear facilities, is very important to the security of the world. Because can you imagine that a nuclear device falls into the hands of an angry, deluded person? Can you imagine having a situation where such a device gets in the wrong hands, and you have the World Trade Center incident, not carried out by a civilian plane, but with a very dangerous device. So really, Russia, and if you look at the integration of the world economy, the interactions of economic institutions, I do not know, I do not think that Russia is a threat to the United States and the West generally. But the refusal of Russia to be part of the West religiously, they are different. Ideologically, they are different. Then they are partly European, they are partly Asian. So this is what the West cannot accept, and they want to dominate, capture and dominate the whole world. But the Japanese are not Christians either.
Exactly. You have worked for the UN system, Ambassador Kalomoh, and in a very senior position, if I may add. What role can an organization like that play in a conflict like this? As a matter of fact, is the UN even objective in a situation like this, especially where the West have already pronounced themselves? Can the UN afford to even differ with the West in general?
No. The UN is nothing but but a voice of the Security Council. And the Security Council nominally has 15 members at any one time, but among those, only 5 have a permanent status in the Security Council with a veto power. Among those 5, the dominant power is obviously the United States, dominant in terms of the degree of influence and all over the world. But the dominants are those China, France, very often cantankerous, Russia, Britain, and the United States. The Secretary General is really in the hands of those 5. He implements a mandate, although the Secretariat writes those mandates, but edited by the member states, those 5. So Secretary General implements the mandates agreed to by the Security Council. But if any one of the 5 is directly concerned with an issue, they will veto the issue, the draft resolution. Like the Russia has vetoed 2 already. And it is Russia and the United States that vetoed the greatest number of resolutions. Here in Namibia, in January of 1976, it was Britain, France, and the United States using triple vetoes for the first time in the history of the UN, vetoing the independence of Namibia, Resolution 385. So they use their vetoes to protect their own interest.
So you're saying in that 1976 process, those 3 countries were in favor of the independence of Namibia?
They were against.
They were against.
They were against. They were in support of South Africa.
It's very interesting. Now, so Putin, Vladimir Putin, is he, in the context of all that you've said so far, Ambassador, is he a warmonger, a senseless warmonger, or a nationalist who fears that history may repeat itself?
From the perspective of the Americans and others, he is a warmonger. From the perspectives of the Russians, he's a Russian patriot. From the perspective of a reasonably objective observer, he is like myself.
Yeah.
Of course, this will be contentious, but I think looking at the history of Russia, looking at the 1994 Memorandum of Understanding involving the United States and Ukraine and Russia and UK, and the history of the painful history of the Second World War, and just the feeling of being under siege following the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
I think Putin is up in defense of what he regards the best national interest of the of Russia. He feels that the very existence of Russia and their independence, and don't forget, this is an ancient history. They are very proud people throughout their history. And say what you may, they are the ones who introduced in the General Assembly of 1960 the principle of the right of self-determination of non-self-governing territories. and they stood by all the people fighting for their right to self-determination. But when their own existence, just out of sheer will of self-preservation, they feel that the NATO encroachment on the territory of Ukraine poses an existential threat to them.
Maybe as we draw closer to the end of this conversation, Ambassador, our government issued a statement on this issue. And I just wonder, when a small country like ours issues statements on these issues, whatever the tone is it necessary? Is it who's listening to Namibia?
Oh man, this is a very small country, but carries a lot of weight.
Yeah.
Diplomatically, morally, and history. First, small, poor, underpopulated, but stands up for what they believe is right. Among those what Namibia believes is right is the right to self-determination. Now, and therefore, they take positions on issues they feel is vitally important. And war and peace issues are important. So they issue statements, and in this particular instance, they recognized the provisions of the UN Charter that calls for the mediation or the settlement of international disputes through mediation and arbitration. There have been efforts between Russia and Ukraine to settle this dispute through diplomatic negotiations. But yeah, there are instances that it's important that you take a position, and very often the government of Namibia does that. In this particular issue, they have not condemned Russia. They have called for the recognition of the right of Ukraine to preserve their territorial integrity and their independence. In an indirect way, that acknowledgement supports the position of Ukraine. They must have the right, but that right should not threaten the existence of Russia. I was actually proud that Namibia abstained at the United Nations General Assembly. There were not many, I think 17 or 18 African countries, but those who abstained are countries that are credible in their foreign policies. Here we have Botswana, South Africa, we have Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Angola. That's a proud company to be in. We are minority, 35 altogether, but yeah, we only want a peaceful, serious, good faith negotiation between Ukraine and Russia. They've started that process, but they are all put forward conditions that each side finds difficult to accept.
Indeed. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time. Really, it was a very enriching conversation as always.
No, thank you very much. It's a situation that I'm not very familiar with. We just mumble through it, but the principle, the cardinal principle here is your right ends where my right begins.
Indeed.
Your security and my security should be compatible.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is what we have here.
Indeed. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much.
Yes. That was Ambassador Tuliameni Kalomoh, a seasoned Namibian diplomat, filling us in on the situation in Ukraine from his own perspective. Thank you for watching.